The rain poured down hard that evening as Richard Montgomery's private train car approached the small station of Pine Valley. Richard was one of those men who had everything money could buy: mansions, cars, boats, you name it. But tonight, something was about to change his life forever. He sat there in his expensive suit looking through some business papers when something caught his eye through the window. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. There on the train tracks ahead was what looked like a small bundle, but then it moved. "Stop the train!" Richard shouted, his heart racing. The moment the train stopped, he jumped out. Into the rain, not caring about his $1,000 suit getting soaked. There, lying on the cold, wet tracks, was a little boy. He couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old. His head was completely bald, and he was wearing a thin hospital gown that was soaked through. The sight made Richard's stomach turn. "Hey, buddy," Richard said softly, kneeling beside the boy. "What's your name?" The boy's eyes fluttered open. They were the most beautiful blue eyes Richard had ever seen, but they were filled with so much sadness. "Tommy," the boy whispered. "Tommy. What are you doing out here all alone?" Richard asked, already taking off his suit jacket to wrap around the shivering child. Tommy's next words hit Richard like a punch to the gut. "They left me here." "Who left you here?" "My mom and dad," Tommy said, his voice barely a whisper. "They said they couldn't pay for the treatments anymore." Richard noticed a crumpled piece of paper in Tommy's small hand. He carefully took it and read the words that would change both their lives forever. "We can't afford to keep him alive anymore. Please, someone help him. We're sorry." For the first time in his life, Richard felt a rage he'd never known before. He'd made deals worth billions, faced down the toughest businessmen in the country, but nothing had ever made him this angry. How could anyone abandon their child like this? Without thinking twice, Richard scooped Tommy up in his arms. The boy weighed almost nothing, and Richard could feel his bones through the wet hospital gown. "How you're coming with me," he said firmly. "But why?" Tommy asked, confusion clear in his weak voice. "Because," Richard said, holding him closer, "nobody deserves to be left alone like this. And I promise you, Tommy, you'll never be alone again." As Richard carried Tommy back to his train car, he already knew his life would never be the same. He'd spent years building his fortune, thinking money was the most important thing in the world. But holding this abandoned, sick child in his arms, he realized how wrong he'd been. His assistant, Maria, gasped when she saw them enter the train car. "Mr. Montgomery, what's going on?" "Call Dr. Peterson at Memorial Hospital," Richard ordered, laying Tommy gently on the plush leather seat. "Tell him we're coming in with an emergency, and get me everything you can find about childhood cancer treatments." As the train changed direction toward the city, Richard sat beside Tommy, holding his small hand. The boy had fallen asleep, exhausted and sick, but still clutching Richard's fingers like a lifeline. Looking at Tommy's peaceful face, Richard made a silent vow. He would use every penny of his fortune if he had to, but this boy would get the best treatment money could buy. More than that, he would make sure Tommy never felt abandoned again. What Richard didn't know was that this wasn't just about saving Tommy's life. This little boy, left alone on the train tracks on a rainy night, was about to teach him what really mattered in life. Sometimes the biggest blessings come in the smallest packages, and sometimes it takes a child to show a grown man how to truly live. The train sped through the night, carrying them toward the city, toward hope, toward a future neither of them could have imagined just hours before. And somewhere in the darkness, a new kind of family was being born. The next morning, Richard paced the halls of Memorial Hospital like a caged lion. He hadn't slept all night, staying by Tommy's side until the doctors insisted he wait outside. While they ran their tests, his usually perfect suit was wrinkled and his tie hung loose around his neck. "Mr. Montgomery," Dr. Peterson approached, holding a thick file of medical records. "We've completed Tommy's initial examinations." Richard straightened up immediately. "How is he?" "He has acute lymphoblastic leukemia," the doctor said. "It's advanced, but treatable. However, the treatment plan would be extensive and expensive." Richard's jaw tightened. "Money is not an issue, doctor. Whatever he needs, he gets. I want the best treatments, the best specialists, whatever it takes." Just then, a nurse rushed up to them. "Dr. Peterson, the police are here. They need to talk about the boy." Two detectives walked down the hospital corridor. The older one, Detective Santos, had kind eyes despite his stern expression. "Mr. Montgomery, we need to discuss the situation with Tommy Wilson. Abandoning a child is a serious crime. We're looking for his parents." Richard felt his anger rising again. To do what? Put them in jail? What about Tommy? He needs someone to care for him right now. Detective Santos looked at him carefully. "Are you volunteering, Mr. Montgomery?" "Yes," Richard said without hesitation. "I want to apply for emergency custody." The younger detective raised his eyebrows. "Mr. Montgomery, with all due respect, you're a single businessman with no experience raising children. The courts might be hesitant." "I don't care," Richard cut him off. "That boy has been through enough. I found him, I saved him, and I'm going to make sure he gets everything he needs." Later that day, Richard sat beside Tommy's bed. The boy looked so small among all the machines and monitors, but some color had returned to his cheeks. "Mr. Montgomery," Tommy said softly. "Call me Richard, buddy." "Richard? Are they going to send me away?" Richard's heart broke at the fear in Tommy's voice. He took the boy's small hand in his. "No, Tommy. I'm going to make sure that never happens. In fact, if you want, you could come live with me." Tommy's blue eyes widened. "Really, but your big house and your important job. Wouldn't I be in the way?" "Nothing is more important than making sure you're safe and healthy," Richard said firmly. "Besides, my house is way too big for just me. It needs someone to make it feel like a real home." A small smile appeared on Tommy's face, the first one Richard had seen. "I've never lived in a big house before. Well, you'll have your own room, and we can decorate it however you want. But first, we need to focus on getting you better." Just then, Maria walked in carrying a large teddy bear and some books. She'd spent the morning buying things she thought might cheer Tommy up. "Look what I brought you," she said, placing the bear next to Tommy. "Every brave boy needs a friend to keep him company." Tommy hugged the bear tight, his eyes shining. "Thank you," he whispered. Richard watched the scene with a warm feeling in his chest, but their moment was interrupted by his phone buzzing. It was Theodore Walsh, his company's board chairman. "Richard, where are you?" "We have the merger meeting in an hour." Richard looked at Tommy, who was showing his new bear to Maria. The decision was easy. "Cancel it," he said. "Cancel all my meetings for the next week. Something more important has come up. More important than the Miller merger. Richard, we've been working on this deal for months. Ted, I found a boy abandoned on the train tracks last night. He has cancer and I'm applying for emergency custody. So yes, this is more important than any merger." There was a long silence on the other end. "Richard, are you sure about this? This isn't like buying a new company. This is a huge responsibility." "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," Richard replied, watching Tommy fall asleep, hugging his new teddy bear. After hanging up, Richard settled back in his chair. His business empire might have to wait, but for the first time in his life, he felt like he was doing something truly meaningful. Maria smiled at him. "You know this is going to change everything, right?" Richard nodded. "Yes, and it's about time things changed. I've spent my whole life building a fortune. But what's the point of all that money if you can't use it to help someone who really needs it?" As the afternoon sun streamed through the hospital window, Richard Montgomery, the man who had everything, realized he was just now finding what he'd been missing all along, a chance to make a real difference in someone's life. News travels fast in a small city, and by the end of the week, everyone knew about Richard Montgomery taking in a sick child. The newspapers couldn't get enough of the story. "Billionaire saves abandoned boy" was splashed across every headline. But not everyone was happy about this sudden change in Richard's life. At the Montgomery Industries headquarters, a group of board members gathered in the main conference room, their faces serious. "This is ridiculous," said Victor Sterling, the oldest board member. "Richard is throwing away everything we've built because of some kid he found on the train tracks. He's cancelled 3 major meetings this week." Theodore Walsh, who had known Richard for 20 years, tried to calm things down. "Now, Victor, let's not overreact. Richard's just trying to help a sick child." "Help? He's applying for custody." Victor slammed his hand on the table. This company needs a focused leader, not someone playing daddy to a dying kid. Just then, the door opened. Elizabeth Montgomery, Richard's younger sister, walked in. She was wearing an expensive designer suit, her high heels clicking on the marble floor. "Well, well," she said, her red lips curving into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I leave for 2 weeks in Paris, and my dear brother decides to adopt a charity case?" Meanwhile, at Memorial Hospital, Richard was meeting with his lawyers. Tommy was sleeping peacefully in his bed, the teddy bear still clutched in his arms. "Mr. Montgomery," said Sarah Chen, his head lawyer, "I need to be honest with you. Getting emergency custody won't be easy. The courts will look at your work schedule, your lack of experience with children. I don't care what it takes." Richard interrupted. "I'll step back from the company if I have to. I'll hire the best nannies, the best tutors, whatever the courts want to see." "There's something else," Sarah said, looking uncomfortable. "Your sister Elizabeth has filed an objection to your custody application." Richard felt like someone had punched him in the gut. "What? Why would she do that?" "She claims you're acting irrationally, that this decision could harm the company and the family's interests. She's requesting a psychological evaluation." Richard's face turned red with anger, but before he could respond, they heard a small voice from the bed. "Richard?" Tommy was awake, looking scared. "Is everything okay?" Richard immediately softened his expression and went to Tommy's side. "Everything's fine, buddy. How are you feeling?" "My stomach hurts a little," Tommy admitted. "But the nurse said I can have ice cream later if I eat all my lunch." Richard smiled, ruffling Tommy's bald head gently. "Then we better make sure you eat every bite." After Tommy fell asleep again, Richard stepped into the hallway with his lawyer. "I want you to fight this with everything we've got. Elizabeth has no right to interfere." "Richard," Sarah said gently, "maybe you should talk to her first. She is your sister." That evening, Elizabeth showed up at the hospital. She was carrying an expensive gift bag and wearing a fake smile. "Hello, dear brother," she said, air-kissing Richard's cheek. "I brought something for your little friend." "Cut the act, Elizabeth," Richard said coldly. "Why are you trying to stop me from helping this boy?" Elizabeth's smile disappeared. "Because you're being foolish. This company is our family's legacy. Father built it from nothing, and now you want to risk everything for some random child." "That random child has a name," Richard said, his voice tight with anger. "His name is Tommy, and he needs someone to care about him." "Oh, please," Elizabeth rolled her eyes. "There are plenty of charities you could donate to. Why do you have to personally adopt him?" "Because I made him a promise," Richard said. "I promised he wouldn't be alone anymore." Elizabeth's eyes narrowed. "You always were too soft, Richard, just like Mother. But I won't let you destroy everything Father built. As..." She turned to leave. She almost bumped into Maria, who was bringing Tommy's dinner tray. "You know what, Elizabeth?" Richard called after her. "Maybe Father's legacy isn't just about money and power. Maybe it's about using what we have to make a difference in someone's life." Elizabeth paused at the door but didn't turn around. "The board meeting is on Monday. Don't be late. If you still care about your position as CEO." After she left, Maria put down the tray and squeezed Richard's shoulder. "Are you okay?" Richard looked through the window at Tommy, who was showing his teddy bear to a young nurse. "I will be. I just never thought my own sister would try to stop me from doing the right thing." "Sometimes," Maria said wisely, "the right thing is the hardest thing to do. That's how you know it's right." Richard nodded, straightening his shoulders. He had a fight ahead of him, not just for Tommy's health, but for the right to be his family. But looking at the brave little boy who had already been through so much, Richard knew he would never give up. Monday's board meeting was going to be interesting. Very interesting indeed. Monday morning arrived with dark clouds hanging over the city. Richard stood in front of his office building, straightening his tie. He hadn't wanted to leave Tommy at the hospital, but this meeting would decide everything. "I'll stay with him," Maria had promised. "You go fight those sharks." The elevator ride to the top floor felt longer than usual. When Richard walked into the boardroom, every head turned to look at him. Elizabeth sat at the far end of the table, wearing a triumphant smile. "Ah, brother dear," she said sweetly, So nice of you to join us." Victor Sterling cleared his throat. "Richard, we've called this emergency meeting because we're concerned about your recent decisions." Richard sat down, his face calm. "You mean my decision to help a sick child?" "Your decision to apply for custody of an unknown boy," Elizabeth corrected. "A decision that has already cost us the Miller merger." "The Miller merger isn't dead," Richard said. "It's just delayed." "Delayed?" Victor stood up, his face red. "Richard, you've missed 3 critical meetings. Our stock has dropped 5 points since this story hit the news. Investors are nervous." Elizabeth pulled out a thick folder. "We've prepared a document outlining our concerns. The board feels that your judgment has been compromised by this emotional situation." Richard looked around the table at the faces. He'd known for years. Some couldn't meet his eyes, others looked sympathetic but scared. "Before you all vote," Richard said quietly, "I want to show you something." He pulled out his phone and played a video. It was Tommy, sitting in his hospital bed the day before, trying to eat soup with shaking hands, but determined to do it himself. "This is Tommy," Richard said. "He's 8 years old, he has cancer. His parents left him to die on a train track because they couldn't afford his treatment. And yes, I'm going to help him. If that makes me unfit to be CEO in your eyes, then so be it." Theodore Walsh, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "Richard, no one's questioning your kindness, but this company employs thousands of people. We have a responsibility to them too." "And what are we teaching those thousands of people?" Richard asked. "That profit matters more than human life, that we should walk away from someone in need because it might hurt our stock price." Elizabeth slammed her hand on the table. "Stop being so dramatic. This isn't about walking away. You could pay for his treatment, set up a trust fund, whatever you want. But custody? Being a father? That's not you, Richard." "How do you know who I am?" Richard's voice was steel. "You've spent the last 10 years in Paris, showing up only for board meetings and holiday parties. You don't know me at all." Just then, Richard's phone rang. It was Maria. His heart stopped when he saw her name. "Maria, what's wrong?" Her voice was shaking. "Richard, you need to come back. Tommy's fever has spiked. The doctors are worried." Richard stood up so fast his chair fell over. "I'm on my way." "We're not finished here," Elizabeth called after him. Richard turned at the door. "Yes, we are. You can vote me out if you want. But right now there's a little boy who needs me more than this company does." He ran to the elevator, his heart pounding. Behind him, he could hear Theodore calling the board to order. At the hospital, Richard found Tommy's room full of doctors and nurses. The little boy was burning with fever, his face flushed red. "What happened?" Richard demanded. Dr. Peterson looked grave. "His body is fighting the treatment. We need to adjust his medication, but it's risky." Tommy's eyes fluttered open. "Richard?" His voice was barely a whisper. "You came back." "Of course I came back." Richard sat beside him, taking his small hand. "I'll always come back." "Mr. Montgomery," a nurse interrupted. "There's someone from your office here." Richard didn't even turn around. "Tell them to go away." "Actually," said Theodore Walsh's voice, "I think you'll want to hear this." Richard looked up. Theodore was standing in the doorway, looking somewhat embarrassed. "The board voted," he said. "You're still CEO, on one condition." "What condition?" "That you let us help." Theodore smiled. "We've set up a foundation in Tommy's name for other families who can't afford treatment. The board will oversee it while you focus on being a dad." For the first time that day, Richard felt tears in his eyes. He looked at Tommy, who had fallen into a restless sleep. "You hear that, buddy?" he whispered. "We're going to help other kids too. No one else will have to go through what you did." Outside the room, the sun finally broke through the clouds. Sometimes, even in the darkest moments, light finds a way to shine through. And sometimes, it takes a child's courage to teach a room full of adults what really matters in life. The next few weeks were a roller coaster of emotions. Tommy's fever finally broke, but the chemotherapy left him weaker than ever. Richard barely left the hospital, running his company from a laptop in Tommy's room. One morning, Richard was dozing in the chair next to Tommy's bed when a commotion in the hallway woke him up. A woman's voice was arguing with the nurses. "I have a right to see him. I'm his mother." Richard's blood ran cold. He stood up just as a thin woman with tired eyes pushed past the nurses into the room. She stopped dead when she saw Richard. "Who are you?" she demanded. "I'm Richard Montgomery," he said coldly. "I'm the one who found your son on the train tracks." The woman, Susan Wilson, flinched at his words. Her husband appeared behind her, looking equally worn down. "We saw the news," Susan said, her voice shaking. "About the foundation, about you wanting to adopt him. And now you've come back?" Richard's voice was like ice. "Now that someone else is paying for his treatment?" "You don't understand," Tommy's father spoke up. "We lost everything, trying to pay for his medicine. Our house, our savings, and we thought... You thought leaving him to die was the answer." Richard stepped between them and Tommy's bed. "Get out. Please," Susan begged. "He's our son. We were desperate." A small voice came from the bed. "Mom?" Tommy was awake, his blue eyes wide with confusion and hurt. Susan rushed forward, but Richard didn't move. "Tommy, baby," she cried. "We're so sorry." Tommy looked at his parents, then at Richard, then back at his parents. His lower lip trembled. "You left me." Those 3 words, spoken so softly, hit everyone in the room like a physical blow. "We didn't want to," his father said. "But we couldn't afford a stop," Richard cut him off. "Don't you dare try to justify what you did. Do you know what could have happened to him that night? If that train had come just a few minutes earlier..." Tommy started crying, big silent tears rolling down his cheeks. Richard immediately went to him, putting a protective arm around his shoulders. "I think you should leave," Richard told the Wilsons. "My lawyers will be in touch." "Your lawyers?" Susan's eyes narrowed. "Are you threatening us?" "No, Mrs. Wilson. I'm promising you that I will do everything in my power to make sure Tommy is safe and cared for. Something you failed to do." Just then, Dr. Peterson walked in. He took in the scene with one glance and quickly checked Tommy's monitors. "His heart rate is elevated. I'm going to have to ask everyone except Mr. Montgomery to leave. Tommy needs rest." After Tommy's parents left, Richard sat on the edge of the bed, holding the crying boy. "They came back," Tommy whispered. "But not because they wanted me. They came back because of you." Richard's heart broke. "Tommy, look at me. What they did was wrong. Nothing can excuse it. But you have people who love you now. Me, Maria, even. Grumpy old Theodore from the board, we're all here for you." Tommy wiped his eyes. "Can I still live with you even though they came back? Buddy, nothing could stop me from being your dad. Not the board, not your parents, not anyone. We're family now." Later that evening, Maria found them both asleep on Tommy's bed. Richard was still in his suit, Tommy curled up against his chest with his teddy bear. She quietly took a photo with her phone. "What's that for?" Richard asked, opening one eye. "For when the judge asks why you should have custody," she said softly. "Some things you can't explain in words." The next morning, Richard's lawyers arrived with news. The Wilsons were fighting the custody application. They claimed they had only left Tommy because they had no choice, and now that the foundation would pay for his treatment, they wanted him back. "Over my dead body," Richard growled. Sarah Chen, his lawyer, looked worried. "Richard, they're his biological parents. The courts tend to favor reunification." "They abandoned him to die," Richard said. "They left their sick child on train tracks in the rain. What judge would send him back to them?" "We'll fight," Sarah promised. "But you need to be prepared. This could get ugly." Richard looked through the window at Tommy, who was having his daily chess lesson with Theodore. The old board member had started visiting every day, teaching Tommy the game and bringing him books about famous chess matches. "I don't care how ugly it gets," Richard said. "That boy's my son now, in every way that matters, and I will not let anyone hurt him again." Sarah nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Then we better get ready for the fight of our lives, because his parents won't give up easily, especially not with the foundation's money involved. Let them try," Richard said, watching Tommy laugh at something Theodore said. "Some things are worth fighting for, and some people are worth fighting everyone for." The custody battle was about to begin, and it would test not just Richard's determination, but also Tommy's strength and the loyalty of everyone around them. But as Maria had said, sometimes the hardest fights are the ones most worth winning. The custody hearing was set for 2 weeks away. Richard spent every spare moment with his lawyers building their case, but more importantly, he spent every possible moment with Tommy. whose health was finally starting to improve. "Your blood counts are looking better," Dr. Peterson said during their morning checkup. "The new treatment protocol is working." Tommy smiled weakly. He'd lost more weight, but his eyes were brighter. "Does that mean I can go home soon?" The doctor looked at Richard. "Actually, yes, I think we can discharge him next week as long as he comes in daily for treatments." Richard's heart leaped. He'd been preparing for this moment. "Tommy, want to see something special?" He pulled out his tablet and showed Tommy pictures of a room. A big bright space with blue walls, a huge bed with a solar system bedspread, and shelves filled with books and toys. Tommy's eyes went wide. "Is that your room?" Richard said, proudly. "If you like it, Maria helped design it. There's even a telescope by the window so you can look at the stars." Tommy touched the screen with trembling fingers. "I've never had my own room before. We always lived in small apartments." His voice trailed off, and Richard knew he was thinking about his parents. The Wilsons had been trying to visit every day, but Tommy refused to see them. Just then, Elizabeth walked into the room. She looked different, less polished, more human somehow. "Hello, Tommy," she said softly. "I'm Richard's sister. Your Aunt Elizabeth." Tommy looked at her suspiciously. Richard tensed, ready to ask her to leave, but something in her expression stopped him. Elizabeth pulled a small box from her designer bag. "I brought you something. It belonged to our father." Inside the box was an old pocket watch, golden and gleaming. "Father gave this to Richard when he graduated college," Elizabeth explained, "but I think you should have it now." Richard stared at his sister in shock. That watch was one of their father's most precious possessions. Tommy carefully took the watch, his small fingers tracing the engraving. "It's beautiful." "Elizabeth," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "What made you change your mind?" She sat down, smoothing her skirt nervously. "I've been watching you these past weeks. Where you are with him. It reminded me of how Father was with us before the company took over his life." She looked at Tommy. "I was wrong to fight this. You two belong together." Just then, Maria burst into the room, her face pale. "Richard, turn." On the TV. Now, on the news, Susan Wilson was giving an interview, tears streaming down her face. "They're trying to buy our son," she sobbed. "Mr. Montgomery thinks he can steal our child just because he has money. But Tommy belongs with his real family." The reporter turned to the camera. "Sources say the Montgomery Foundation, which promises to pay for Tommy Wilson's cancer treatment, may withdraw that offer if custody is not granted to Richard Montgomery. Is this billionaire using his money to manipulate a desperate family? More on this story." Richard switched off the TV, his hands shaking with rage. "That's a lie. The foundation has nothing to do with the custody case." "Of course it doesn't," Elizabeth said sharply, "and I'll prove it." She pulled out her phone and dialed a number. "Janet, get me a press conference, now. It's time everyone knew the truth about the Wilsons." Tommy looked scared. "Richard, what's going to happen?" Richard sat on the bed and pulled Tommy close. "Nothing's going to change, buddy. They can say whatever they want on TV, but they can't change the truth. And the truth is, you're my son now." Elizabeth watched them, her eyes soft. "You know what? I think I'll testify at the hearing. The judge should know what kind of man my brother really is." Maria smiled. The mighty Elizabeth Montgomery admitting she was wrong. Now that's what I call a miracle. That evening, after Tommy had fallen asleep, Richard found Elizabeth in the hospital cafeteria. "Thank you," he said simply. She stirred her coffee. "You know, I was so busy trying to protect Father's legacy that I forgot what that legacy really was. It wasn't just about the company. It was about family, about doing what's right. Better late than never," Richard smiled. "The Wilsons won't give up easily," Elizabeth warned. "That interview was just the beginning." "Let them try," Richard said. "They might have the sympathy card, but we have something better." "What's that?" "The truth. And more importantly, we have Tommy. That boy has more strength in his little finger than they have in their whole bodies." As if on cue, his phone buzzed with a message from Maria. It was a photo of Tommy, fast asleep with the pocket watch clutched in his hand. Elizabeth looked at the photo and smiled. "You know what? For the first time in years, I think Father would be proud of us, both of us. The custody hearing was still a week away, but something had shifted. The Montgomery siblings were united again, stronger than ever, and this time they weren't fighting for money or power. They were fighting for love, for family, for a little boy who had somehow managed to heal not just his own wounds, but theirs too. The day Tommy was discharged from the hospital was full of sunshine. Richard had arranged everything perfectly. The house was ready, a team of private nurses was on standby, and Maria had stocked the kitchen with all of Tommy's favorite foods. "Ready to go home, buddy?" Richard asked, helping Tommy into his wheelchair. Hospital policy required patients to leave in wheelchairs, even though Tommy insisted he could walk. "Yes," Tommy beamed, clutching his teddy bear and the pocket watch. From Elizabeth. But then his smile faltered. "Will you stay with me, or do you have to go to work?" "I'm all yours," Richard assured him. "I've cleared my schedule for the whole week." As they walked through the hospital corridor, nurses and doctors came out to say goodbye. Tommy had become everyone's favorite patient over the past months. "Don't forget your checkup tomorrow," Dr. Peterson reminded them, "and call immediately if anything feels wrong." Just as they reached the hospital entrance, they saw Susan and James Wilson standing there. Tommy immediately tensed up. "Please," Susan stepped forward. "We just want to talk." Richard felt Tommy's hand grip his tighter. "Not now," he said firmly. "This is supposed to be a happy day." "He's our son," James Wilson's voice rose. "You can't keep us from him forever." Several people in the lobby turned to stare. Tommy started trembling. "Actually, I can." Richard's voice was steel. "There's a restraining order in place until the hearing. Or did your lawyers forget to mention that?" Elizabeth, who had been waiting by Richard's car, stepped forward. "I suggest you leave before I call security, and if you try another media." "Stunt, remember, I have proof of what really happened that night." The Wilsons backed away, but Susan called out, "Tommy, baby, we love you. We're fighting for you." Tommy buried his face in Richard's suit jacket. Richard could feel him crying. Silently, the drive home was quiet. Tommy stared out the window, watching the city streets give way to the tree-lined avenue where Richard lived. "Wow," Tommy whispered as they pulled up to the mansion. "It's like a castle." "Wait till you see inside," Elizabeth smiled. She had become a regular visitor, determined to make up for her initial opposition by being the best aunt possible. Maria was waiting at the door. "Welcome home, Tommy." The house had been transformed. Colorful balloons floated everywhere, and a banner read, "Welcome. Home, Tommy," in bright letters. But the best part was the group of people waiting inside. Theodore from the board, Sarah the lawyer, even some of the nurses who had become friends. "You did all this for me?" Tommy asked in wonder. "Of course we did," Theodore said gruffly, trying to hide how emotional he was. "Now who's ready for some chess?" The afternoon was perfect. Tommy ate more than he had in weeks, played chess with Theodore, and showed everyone his new room. But by evening, he was exhausted. As Richard tucked him into his new bed, Tommy asked, quietly, "Richard, can I ask you something?" "Anything, buddy." "Why did they come back? My parents. They didn't want me before. Why do they want me now?" Richard sat on the edge of the bed, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes people make terrible mistakes. And sometimes when they realize their mistakes, they want to fix them, but that doesn't erase what they did. Do you think they really love me?" "I think they do, in their way," Richard said honestly. "But love isn't just about feelings, Tommy. It's about actions. It's about being there, no matter what." Tommy was quiet for a long moment. "Like you are. Like I always will be. Even if I get sick again. Even if you get sick 100 times. You're my son now, Tommy. Nothing will ever change that." Tommy fingered the pocket watch on his bedside table. "Elizabeth said this watch belonged to your dad. What was he like?" Richard smiled. "He was tough but fair. He built his company from nothing, but he never forgot what mattered most, family. That's why Elizabeth gave you the watch. It means you're part of our family now." "I like being part of your family," Tommy yawned. "Even if Elizabeth is kind of scary sometimes." Richard laughed. "Don't worry, she's much nicer now. I think you've melted her frozen heart." After Tommy fell asleep, Richard found Elizabeth and Maria in the kitchen. "He's finally asleep," he said, accepting a cup of coffee. "It's been a big day." "The hearing is in 3 days," Sarah reminded them. "The Wilsons' lawyers filed a new motion today. They're claiming we coerced them into abandoning Tommy by making them think they had no other options for his treatment." "That's ridiculous," Maria exclaimed. "They didn't even know about Richard or the foundation when they left him." "We'll fight it," Elizabeth said firmly. "I've hired private investigators. They've found some interesting things about the Wilsons' past, things the judge should know." Richard looked troubled. "I don't want to destroy them, Elizabeth. They're still Tommy's parents." "No," Elizabeth's voice was sharp. "You're Tommy's parent. They lost that right the moment they left him on those tracks, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows it." Later that night, Richard checked on Tommy one last time. The boy was sleeping peacefully, moonlight streaming through his window onto the telescope they hadn't had time to try yet. "Sweet dreams, son," Richard whispered. Tomorrow they would face more battles, but tonight, in this moment, everything was perfect. The day before the custody hearing, a storm hit the city. Thunder rolled across the sky as Richard sat in his home office, going over last-minute details with Sarah. "The Wilsons' lawyers have been busy," Sarah said, spreading papers across his desk. "They've painted quite a picture. Poor, hard-working parents forced to make an impossible choice, while the rich businessman swoops in to steal their child." "It's not true," Richard growled. "They're twisting everything." A crack of thunder made the windows rattle. Moments later, Tommy appeared at the office door, pale and shaking. "Richard, can I stay with you? The storm—" "Come here, buddy." Richard opened his arms and Tommy ran to him. "Not a fan of thunder?" Tommy shook his head, burrowing into Richard's chest as another thunderclap boomed outside. "In our old apartment, the windows would shake really bad during storms. Mum and Dad were usually working late, so I was alone." Richard's heart clenched. He looked at Sarah over Tommy's head, and she nodded, understanding. Every detail about Tommy's past life strengthened their case. "You're never alone anymore," Richard promised, holding him close. "Hey, want to see something cool?" He led Tommy to the big bay window. "Count with me after each lightning flash. 1, 2, 3, boom!" See, the thunder was 3 seconds after the lightning. That means the storm is about 3 miles away. It's moving away from us. Tommy's eyes widened. "Really? How do you know that?" "My father taught me that trick when I was your age. I used to be scared of storms too." They spent the next hour counting the seconds between lightning and thunder, watching the storm move farther and farther away. Finally, Tommy fell asleep in Richard's lap. "The judge needs to see this," Sarah said softly, looking at them. "This is what real parenting looks like." The next morning dawned clear and bright. Richard helped Tommy dress in a new suit that Maria had bought specially for court. "Remember," Richard said, straightening Tommy's tie, "you just have to tell the truth. That's all anyone can ask." "Will I have to talk to them?" My other parents?" "Only if you want to. The judge might ask you some questions, but I'll be right there." Elizabeth arrived, looking elegant in a navy suit. "Ready for battle, boys?" The courthouse was packed. News of the custody battle had spread, and reporters crowded the steps. Richard shielded Tommy from the cameras, hurrying him inside. The Wilsons were already there with their lawyers. Susan wore a simple dress and no makeup, looking every bit the struggling mother. James had traded his usual work clothes for a suit. That looked slightly too big. "All rise," the bailiff called as Judge Martinez entered. The morning was a parade of witnesses. The Wilsons' lawyers called character witnesses, their pastor, neighbors, Tommy's old teachers. All talked about what good parents they had been before Tommy got sick. Then it was their turn. Sarah called Dr. Peterson first. "In my 30 years of practice," he testified, "I've never seen a case of medical abandonment this severe. The boy was left in life-threatening conditions, already weakened by his illness." Elizabeth testified next, her voice steady. "My brother has changed since Tommy came into his life. He's not just providing financially. He's there for every treatment, every nightmare, every milestone. That's what a real father does." During a break, Richard found Tommy in the courthouse hallway with Maria. "You okay, buddy?" Tommy nodded bravely. "Hey, Elizabeth was really good. She made Mom cry." Richard sighed. Despite everything, it hurt him to see Tommy suffering. Sometimes the truth is painful, but it's still the truth. After lunch, it was the Wilsons' turn to testify. We were desperate, Susan sobbed. The bills kept piling up. We'd lost our house, our savings. We thought if we left him at the hospital, they'd have to help him. But you didn't leave him at a hospital, Sarah's voice cut through the courtroom. You left him on train tracks, in the rain, with a fever of 103 degrees. Would you like to explain that choice to the court? James Wilson broke down. We weren't thinking straight. We couldn't watch him die slowly because we couldn't afford to save him. And now, Sarah pressed, now that someone else is paying for his treatment, you want him back. He's our son, Susan cried. We made a terrible mistake, but we love him. Finally, it was Tommy's turn. The judge spoke to him privately in her chambers, with only the lawyers present. When they came out, Tommy ran straight to Richard. You did great, Richard whispered, hugging him. Judge Martinez called a recess until the next morning for her decision. That night, nobody could sleep. What if they win? Tommy asked in a small voice as Richard tucked him in. What if I have to go back? Richard's heart was breaking, but his voice was firm. Listen to me, Tommy. No matter what happens tomorrow, you will always be my son. Always, and I will never, ever stop fighting for you. Tommy pulled out the pocket watch, holding it tight. Promise? I promise. With all my heart. As Richard left Tommy's room, he found Elizabeth in the hallway. He's terrified, Richard said. Elizabeth squeezed his shoulder. The judge saw how he is with you. She saw how he runs from them and runs to you. That has to count for something. It has to, Richard agreed. Because I can't lose him, Elizabeth. I just can't. Tomorrow would bring either joy or heartbreak. But for tonight, Richard sat in the chair by Tommy's bed, watching him sleep, counting the hours until they would know their fate. The morning of the judge's decision felt like the longest of Richard's life. Tommy barely touched his breakfast, pushing his eggs around the plate while clutching the pocket watch in his other hand. What time do we have to be at court? He asked for the third time. 9 o'clock, Richard answered patiently. We have plenty of time. Elizabeth arrived early, carrying a stack of newspapers. Her face was worried as she pulled Richard aside. The media coverage isn't good, she whispered. They're painting us as the villains. Billionaire versus struggling parents is the headline everywhere. I don't care about the headlines, Richard said. I only care about Tommy. Just then, Maria rushed in, her face pale. Richard, turn on the TV, now. On every news channel, James Wilson was giving a press conference on the courthouse steps. He looked tired and sincere, his voice breaking with emotion. We made a terrible mistake, he was saying. We were drowning in debt, watching our son die because we couldn't afford to save him. We reached our breaking point, but abandoning him was wrong. And we'll spend the rest of our lives making it up to him. All we're asking for is a chance to be a family again. Tommy stood in the doorway, watching the TV. His face was blank, but his hands were shaking. They're lying, he said, quietly. They didn't break, they planned it. Everyone turned to look at him. What do you mean, sweetheart? Maria asked gently. The night they left me, Tommy's voice trembled. I heard them talking. Dad said the insurance wouldn't pay anymore. Mom said, maybe if they left me somewhere. Public. Rich people would feel sorry for me and help. They waited until it was dark. They drove around for hours, looking for the right place. Richard felt sick. Elizabeth's face had gone white with rage. Even Maria, who always tried to see the best in everyone, looked horrified. Tommy, Sarah the lawyer stepped forward. She had arrived just in time to hear his words. Why didn't you tell us this before? Tommy looked down at his shoes. I didn't want to remember, and I didn't want them to get in trouble. They're still my parents. Richard knelt in front of him. Tommy, look at me. What they did was wrong. Not just leaving you, but planning it like that. You don't have to protect them anymore. Can I tell the judge? Tommy asked. Before she decides? Sarah was already on her phone. I'm calling her chambers right now. An hour later, they were back, in court. The Wilsons looked confident as they entered, but their faces fell when they saw Tommy sitting at the witness stand. Tommy, Judge Martinez said kindly, I understand you have something you want to tell the court. Tommy's voice was small but clear as he described that night. The long drive in the dark, the way his mother had kissed his forehead and whispered, "Someone will find you." The sound of their car driving away. Susan Wilson broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. James put his head in his hands. The judge's face was like stone as she listened. When Tommy finished, she called both legal teams to her chambers. The wait seemed endless. Finally, everyone was called back in. Judge Martinez's voice rang through the silent courtroom. "In all my years on the bench, I have never seen a case quite like this one. The Wilsons claim they acted out of desperation, but Tommy's testimony reveals a calculated plan to abandon their child in hopes that his plight would attract wealthy benefactors. This was not a moment of weakness. It was premeditated child endangerment." She paused, looking directly at Tommy. "Young man, no child should ever have to experience what you did. But out of this terrible situation, something remarkable happened. You found someone who loves you unconditionally, who puts your needs first, who has created a true home for you." Richard held his breath. "It is the finding of this court that the Wilsons' parental rights are hereby terminated. Full custody is granted to Richard Montgomery, with the adoption process to begin immediately." The courtroom erupted. Tommy launched himself at Richard, who caught him in a tight hug, both of them crying freely now. "It's over," Richard whispered. "You're my son, forever." Elizabeth was crying too, hugging Maria. Sarah was beaming. Even Theodore, who had come to show his support, was wiping his eyes. Susan Wilson's wail cut through the celebration. "No, you can't take our son." "Mrs. Wilson," Judge Martinez's voice was sharp, "your son has been taken care of by Mr. Montgomery, while you and your husband have been busy playing victims for the media. The court also recommends criminal charges be filed for child endangerment and abandonment." "Officers." 2 police officers stepped forward as James and Susan Wilson were led away in handcuffs. Tommy watched them go, his face pressed against Richard's chest. "I didn't want them to go to jail." "I know, buddy," Richard stroked his hair. "That's because you have a good heart. But sometimes people have to face the consequences of their actions." Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed them, but Elizabeth handled them like a pro. "Today justice was served," she announced, and more importantly, a family was made official, the Montgomery family. That evening, they had a celebration dinner at home. Theodore brought a new chess set for Tommy. Maria made his favorite chocolate cake. Elizabeth announced she was moving back from Paris permanently to be closer to her nephew. As Richard tucked Tommy into bed that night, the boy was almost too excited to sleep. "Can I change my name?" he asked. "To Montgomery." Richard smiled through tears. "Of course you can. First thing tomorrow, we'll start the paperwork. And you're really my dad, now forever and ever?" "Forever and ever," Richard promised. "No matter what." Tommy held up the pocket watch. "Then this really belongs to me now, because I'm really part of the family." "You always were," Richard said. "From the moment I found you, the judge just made it official." After Tommy finally fell asleep, Richard stood at his bedroom window looking at the stars. Tomorrow they would face new challenges: Tommy's ongoing treatment, the adoption process, the media attention. But tonight, everything was perfect. Tonight, they were officially what they had been in their hearts for months: father and son. 1. Year had passed since the custody hearing. The gardens of the Montgomery estate were filled with flowers and laughter as guests arrived for a very special celebration, Tommy's official adoption day. The past year hadn't been easy. Tommy's treatment had been rough, with setbacks and scary moments. But through it all, Richard never left his side. And finally, 3 months ago, they got the news they'd been praying for. Tommy was in remission. "Dad," Tommy called out from his bedroom window, "when are people coming?" Richard smiled at hearing that word, Dad. It still made his heart skip a beat every time Tommy said it. "Soon, buddy. Are you ready?" Tommy Montgomery, officially Theodore Thomas Montgomery as of today, was wearing a suit that matched his father's. His hair had grown back thick and dark, and his cheeks were rosy with health. The pocket watch hung proudly from his vest pocket. "Almost," Tommy called back. "Aunt Elizabeth is helping me with my tie." Elizabeth had become a different person over the past year. She'd not only moved back from Paris, but had also taken charge of the Montgomery Foundation, which now helped hundreds of families afford cancer treatment for their children. Maria appeared at Richard's side, carrying a huge cake. "Can you believe how far we've come?" Richard watched as Tommy ran down the stairs, his aunt following more gracefully behind him. "Sometimes it feels like a dream. That night on the train tracks seems so long ago." "And sometimes," Elizabeth said, straightening Tommy's tie one last time, "the best dreams are the ones that come true." The guests began arriving. Theodore came first, carrying a wrapped chess set, though Tommy had long since learned to beat him at the game. Dr. Peterson arrived with several nurses who had cared for Tommy during his hospital stays. Sarah brought the final adoption papers, officially ready for signing. Even some of the board members who had initially opposed Richard's decision came to celebrate. Won over by the way Tommy had transformed not just Richard's life, but the whole company's culture. The Montgomery Foundation had become as important as their profit margins. "Dad," Tommy tugged at Richard's sleeve, "can I show everyone my new telescope, please?" After the ceremony, Richard promised, the telescope had been a gift to celebrate. Tommy's remission, a proper professional one that let them spend hours exploring the stars together. As everyone gathered in the garden, the judge who had granted Richard custody a year ago stood ready to finalize the adoption. But first, Richard had something to say. "A year ago," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "I was a different man. I thought success meant money in the bank and power in the boardroom. Then one rainy night, I found something more valuable than all my wealth. I found my son." Tommy beamed up at him, eyes shining. "Tommy," Richard continued, "you didn't just become my son, you taught me what it means to be a father. You showed me that real wealth isn't counted in dollars, it's counted in moments, in chess games and bedtime stories. In holding hands through hard times and celebrating the good ones." Elizabeth wiped away tears as Richard knelt in front of Tommy. "So today, we're not just making it official on paper. We're celebrating the family we chose to be, the family we already are in our hearts." Tommy threw his arms around Richard's neck. "I love you, Dad." There wasn't a dry eye in the garden as they signed the papers. Judge Martinez smiled warmly as she made her final proclamation. "By the power vested in me, I hereby declare the adoption complete. Congratulations, Mr. Montgomery, and congratulations, Theodore Thomas Montgomery." The garden erupted in applause. Maria brought out the cake, and Theodore set up the chessboard. Elizabeth started telling everyone about the Foundation's latest projects. It was perfect chaos, the kind only family can create. Later that evening, as the party wound down, Richard found Tommy at his telescope. "Look, Dad," he exclaimed, "you can see Jupiter tonight." Richard looked through the telescope, remembering how weak Tommy had been just a year ago. Now he was strong, healthy, and officially a Montgomery. "Dad," Tommy said thoughtfully, "do you think there are other kids out there like I was, scared and alone?" "Probably," Richard said honestly. "That's why we have the foundation now." Tommy was quiet for a moment. "When I grow up, I want to help them, like you helped me." Richard hugged his son close. "You already are helping them, buddy. Your story gives people hope, and sometimes hope is the most important medicine of all." Inside the house, Elizabeth was showing Maria old family photos, now updated to include Tommy. Theodore was dozing in an armchair, a half-finished chess game in front of him. Through the window, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. "Make a wish," Richard said, pointing to a shooting star. Tommy shook his head, smiling. "I don't need to. I already have everything I ever wished for." Richard looked at his son, this brave, kind boy who had changed his life in so many ways. Sometimes the greatest gifts come in unexpected moments. Sometimes the worst nights bring the brightest dawns. And sometimes, on a rainy night on some train tracks, you find not just a child to save, but a soul to heal your own. "Me too, son," Richard whispered, holding Tommy close as they watched the stars together. "Me too." Above them, the night sky sparkled with possibilities. Each star a reminder that even in the darkest moments, light finds a way to shine through. And in the garden of the Montgomery estate, a father and son stood together, there, hearts full of the greatest wealth of all, the love of family.